Okay, hello everybody. I hope the board is nice and clear today. I might actually put the camera a little bit closer up, a bit closer to the board so you can see it better. Probably should have done this before, but I'm just going to do it now. Okay, that looks a little bit better. I'm sorry that you can see my face so close up. It's obviously not very pleasant. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear for all the board. There's a lot of information on the board today, as you can see. We're going to look at non-finite verbs and finite verbs, which is another piece of terminology. Hi, everybody. Hi. Sorry, I can't pronounce those names. They're a little bit beyond me. But hi, guys. So we're going to look at finite and non-finite verbs. Now, this is terminology, of course. I would call a finite verb an ordinary verb, which has a subject and very often an object. So these two sentences are good examples of typical finite verbs, but there are millions of them because anytime you have a main clause, in other words, anytime you have a full sentence, you absolutely must have a subject and a verb, and the verb must be finite, which means it's going to have a subject, it's going to have tense, it's going to show if it's singular or plural, so it's going to show a lot. So main clauses must have a finite verb. In every English sentence there must be a finite verb, and that just means a verb with a subject and maybe with an object. Okay, so I killed him is a typical standard main clause, and it's got a finite verb in it, killed, because the verb killed has a subject and it even has an object, him. Okay, that's all finite verb means. Finite verb is very simple. It's the ordinary verb that we all know and love that has a subject and it has a tense as well. Now, I'm actually aiming this episode at native speakers, and aiming it at native speakers who want to improve their parts of speech. So when you have a finite verb, if you just have I kicked the ball, you have just a verb, very simple verb, kicked in past simple. But that is a very simple tense, past simple, and it's not the only tense we have. We actually have 12 tenses in English. So we could say I kicked, we could say I was kicking, we could say I had kicked, had been kicking, have been kicking, am kicking, kick, and will kick, will be kicking, will have kicked, and even will have been kicking. But they're the 12 tenses, and when you say all of those forms, you have an auxiliary verb and an auxiliary verb and the main verb. So please remember that when we make a tense, the little verbs like have, be, and do, these little verbs that make tenses and negatives and passives, they are called auxiliary verbs. And it's have, be, and do, really, that are the three main auxiliary verbs for making tense. There are also modal verbs, which is another class of auxiliary verbs, but I don't want to talk about them today. I've done lots of videos on modal verbs, so please type into the search bar Mr. Skype Lessons modal verbs if you want to improve your modal verbs. Anyway, I wanted to make it clear that finite verbs very often have an auxiliary verb before the main verb. Okay, so in main clauses, you'll very often have auxiliary verbs before the main verb. So whenever you've got a main clause, you always need to think in terms of subject, verb, object. Okay, that's always how the main clause is structured. Subject, verb, object. Subordinate clauses might be structured like that. For example, here we have although, subordinating conjunction, and then subject, it, verb, was, that's not right, is it? We've got subject and then verb, was raining, auxiliary verb and then main verb. So here we don't actually have an object, we just have subject and verb, and quite often that can happen. If the verb is intransitive, then it doesn't take an object and it's a main clause just when you say he knows. That's a main clause because know doesn't need an object. It can have an object, but it doesn't need an object. Now, subjects and objects, they must be nouns. That's the first thing to remember. They must be nouns. They might be nouns which are being modified by adjectives. So we might say the happy man, the generous man, the tall man, but still the man is the subject of the verb has been eating. Okay, so subjects must be nouns and objects must be nouns as well. This is very important and very useful when you're doing parts of speech. Now I want to make one thing clear. It doesn't have to be just a word or a couple of words or a slightly longer noun phrase like the man that I met yesterday. We could have a whole clause there, like that I met yesterday would be a relative clause. It's an adjective clause because it's describing the man, and that's all your subject. So the subject could be a really long expanded noun phrase, but the subject could even be a subordinate clause. So we could say, to get the best results is important. And then the subordinate clause, to get the best results, it's functioning as a noun phrase. We call it a noun phrase because the subject must be a noun, it must be a thing. And so to get the best results is our noun phrase, and we use that as subject. So don't think when I say it has to be a noun, do understand that what I mean is it could be a noun or a noun phrase, which may be a whole subordinate clause. And this shows you why grammar is so complicated. Because even though we've got subject, verb, object, and that's a standard main clause, nice and easy, actually the subject could be a subordinate clause. So main clauses can have a subordinate clause here and a subordinate clause here as the object. So that already makes things much more complicated. We could have clauses within clauses within clauses. So we could have a main clause with a subordinate clause here, and inside the subordinate clause we've got subject, verb, object, and the subject of that subordinate clause is another subordinate clause. So you can have clauses within clauses within clauses. That's why language is infinite, basically, because you could keep putting clauses within clauses within clauses. So that's why nothing about grammar is very simple or straightforward. Now, let me talk a little bit about non-finite verbs. I learned most of this teaching English as a foreign language and not knowing it from perhaps a linguistic point of view, but understanding it from the point of view of how do I get somebody to use this stuff correctly when they speak. And so I'm going to talk about it from that perspective because it's quite useful. Now, the non-finite verbs could be split up into at least 4 categories. Hello to the Ukraine. We could have an infinitive without to, which is very often called the bare infinitive, the naked infinitive if you prefer, but the bare infinitive is what they usually say. And an infinitive without to we use in certain situations. We use them after modal verbs, firstly. So I said that modal verbs are important. They're important for one reason, because you say, I must go, I must play, I must have. And the modal there, must, is functioning as an auxiliary, but we always use the bare infinitive after modal verbs, okay? If we want another verb there, we have to use the bare infinitive of the verb. Now, infinitives are non-finite verbs because they don't show tense. When you say I must go, it doesn't show you the tense of go. It doesn't show you if go is singular or plural. And very often it doesn't have a subject. Whereas in finite verbs, they must have a subject. A finite verb must have a subject. A non-finite verb doesn't have to. So when you say something like, I will give up, the I is the subject of will, but the give up is just sitting there without a subject. If you want to say I will give up smoking, smoking is the object. And because it's an object, it's a noun. And we call ing words, which are nouns, gerunds. The gerund is always a noun. The participle looks exactly the same, but it's an adjective. And that's very annoying, and it means we have to work out which one's which in a lot of sentences. And it's not so easy. So after modal verbs, we use the bare infinitive, and it's a non-finite verb because it doesn't have a subject. It's not clear anyway. I mean, obviously, it's the I who should give up, and so it does have an implied subject. Infinitives can have, yeah, I agree. 2 plus infinitive and gerunds, they have many other forms as well, but it's not showing tense, it's showing aspect, which is something different. These verbs, finite verbs, will show tense, they'll show present or past or future. The non-finite verbs don't show tense and they don't show number, and they very often don't even have a subject, or the subject is just implied. And so we'll look at that. I mean, when we say, I will give up smoking, obviously you're talking about you. You are the person that will give up or must give up smoking. And so there is an implied subject, but it's not right next to that verb. And it certainly doesn't show you number. If you say they will give up, or one man will give up, two men will give up remains the same. It doesn't change and show you if you're dealing with one or two. So it certainly doesn't show number. Okay, so we could use a non-finite verb as an infinitive after a modal verb, and we must. And we could also use a non-finite verb, an infinitive. We do use it after make and let, but we have an object in there first. He made me, subject, verb, object, slow down. And so here, there is an implied subject again, the me, but it doesn't show number. It doesn't matter if we say he made one man slow down or he made two men slow down. Slow down stays the same for one or two. So again, it's not showing number, and really it's not showing tense either. You know, it's not showing am slowing down, have been slowing down, that kind of thing. Okay, that doesn't sound very relevant, that question, but try and make it relevant to this lesson and I will deal with it. So this one doesn't have an object. Oh, and one other thing about infinitives, we do also use the infinitive for imperatives, which are commands. And in this kind of sentence where there's a command, you don't have subject, verb, object. You just have wait here, yeah? Wait here. Or don't look, yeah? Don't look now, or something like, it's a command, it's an order, and we use it with the infinitive. So 2 plus infinitive is another non-finite verb form. Now, when you're doing parts of speech, just treat the 2 plus infinitive as a verbal unit. They're sometimes called verbal nouns. They're sometimes called noun phrases. I'm not sure that I would call it a verbal noun, because quite often it's more like a complement than a noun. And that's why I've written here as complement of the verb rather than object of the verb. There is a reason for it. It's because complement has a slightly different meaning than object, and it seems to work, in my opinion, better for 2 plus infinitive, although I'm sure grammarians argue about this kind of topic. Anyway, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. You use 2 plus infinitive after a number of different verbs in English. Want being the most obvious one. I want to eat, I want to drink, I want to have a cigarette. Whatever it is, you're going to have 2 plus infinitive after want. And I hope you can feel that it's necessary. If we take out to eat, we can't just say, I want. Want needs an object, or we could call it a complement. I mean, you can call it an object, meaning it's a transitive verb and it needs an object, but you could say that there's something missing and you need to add something to make it complete, and that we call a complement. As complement of the verb, we would say, I want to eat, I want to drink, and there are loads of other verbs that you can just memorize. Promise to do, it follows the same pattern, promise to do something. What else? There are lots of other verbs that take 2 plus infinitive. Offer to do something, promise to do something. There are many others. I don't have a list right off the cuff, but I should do, because I used to do this very often in classes and remind students about which verbs are always followed by 2 plus infinitive. But when they are, just treat the verb as a unit, and in parts of speech you can just say it's another verb. Yes, so you've got I, subject, want, verb, to eat, another verb, and you can just call that complete, or you can say I want to eat an ice cream, and then an ice cream is the object. Okay, so this non-finite verb is in the middle of a main clause, and very often they are. Okay, but it's not just after verbs we use 2 plus infinitive. We also use 2 plus infinitive after objects that come after verbs. So this is as complement of the object. Now you could see this as subject, verb, object, I want him, and then subject, verb, because he has to stay. And so this is really quite a strange structure, because really the to stay is the complement of the object him. It's describing him. Yeah, it's describing what he must do. He must stay. And so it's quite, I recommend that you learn these different patterns, just because here, I mean, really, you could treat the whole thing as the object. You could say, I want, what do you want? Him to stay. And so the whole thing is the object. But if we split it up even more, of course, to stay is referring to him. So we could say that's the subject and that's the verb. And it's like a little clause within a longer clause. Subject, verb, object, I want him to stay. And then non-finite clause, him to stay. It's not showing number or it has got a subject really, it's got the him, but you've got a kind of clause within a larger clause, and that's very common. So that's one way to use to plus infinitive. Yep, exactly, I want him to help me would be a good example. And then to help also has an object, so I want him to stay with me, you could say, and then you've got subject, verb, object again, I want him to stay with me, and you've got one clause within a bigger clause. Okay, and you should notice that to plus infinitive can come after an object pronoun. Gerunds technically can't, although we use them like they can all the time. So I would normally say, do you mind me arriving late? But it's wrong, it's wrong. I would normally say that because loads of people say this. And if you check on Google Ngrams, you'll see that a lot of people speak in the wrong way, and a lot of people use gerunds in the wrong way. If it's a gerund, you shouldn't use me. Although many people do, you should say my, because this is a noun and it's the object of that verb, so you could only have a possessive pronoun there if it's a noun. This one is actually functioning more like a verb. That's why I call it a complement and not an object, because it's functioning more like a verb. It's actually the verb and that's the subject, him. And so it's functioning in a very different way than the gerund. Okay, this is very confusing, very advanced stuff. But the thing to take away from this, piece of information that I'd like you to take away from this, is that to plus infinitive can be used after the object of a verb, him. Gerund cannot. It is the direct object of a verb. The arriving is the object of mind, not of me. It wouldn't make any sense to say it's the object of me anyway, or if it were, it would be a participle describing me and not a gerund. Okay, as complement of the subject. So if you say something like to live is to think, I think Cicero said this, but to live is to think is describing to live, and so it's the complement of the subject. Now I want to make it clear here that gerunds can be used here. You could say living is thinking, but we tend to use to plus infinitive for a potential future, and it's more literary, it sounds more poetic than the gerund, which is more often used for past, and it's more concrete. Now the way to see this is take a verb like remember, which could be to plus infinitive or gerund, and if you say remember to lock the door, you're talking about the potential future. But if you say I remember locking the door, you're talking about the past, and it's a very concrete action that you did. So gerunds are very concrete actions, they're nouns, whereas to plus infinitive tends to talk about something which could potentially happen in the future. So if you're interested in that, that's something else to remember. So we can also use them as subject, just as we can use gerunds as subject. We could say to err is human, or we could say erring is human, but it would sound less literary. That's why I put that literary there, sound less poetic. So we can use to plus infinitive as subject or gerund as subject. But I would like to say that most of the time we'll use gerund as subject. I think it's rare that people will say to ski is fun. Technically it's okay though, it's correct, but most people would say skiing is fun. Okay. We can use to plus infinitive after adjectives as an adjective complement, and you can't use gerund here. You have to use to plus infinitive. He's unlikely. What is he unlikely to do? He's unlikely to run that fast, and to run is a non-finite verb. It's not in a tense, It's not showing if it's singular or plural, so it's a non-finite verb. And the subject is not clear, but it's actually the he, of course. It's referring to the he that has to run that fast. But it's not as clear as when you have subject, verb, object. It doesn't follow that pattern. Not this clause anyway, the clause with the non-finite verb. So we use to plus infinitive after adjectives, but we use gerund after prepositions. For example, he is good at juggling, not he is good at to juggle. That's impossible. So adjectives are always to plus infinitive, prepositions are always gerund. Now, I'll quickly mention gerund, which must be the noun. So this means that if the ing word, because gerunds are ing words, just like participles are ing words, if the ing word is the subject of the sentence, it must be a gerund, it can't be a participle, because subjects must be nouns. If it's the object of the sentence, it must be a gerund, it can't be a participle, because objects are nouns. So I like playing chess. Now, it's interesting again to see that you could say, I like to play chess. So you could use the to plus infinitive here, and then it's the complement of a verb. But here it's really like the object of a verb, because it really is the activity. What do you like? You like playing chess. So there is the object of the verb like, and so that means it must be a noun. But it can also be the direct object of another verb, and it means that there's a lot of mistakes here. There are a lot of mistakes here, because a lot of people say, do you mind me arriving late? Certainly everyone in this area says, speaks like that. And a lot of people say, I insisted on him buying me a drink. It's actually better to say, I insisted on his buying me a drink. So there are loads of examples of this, but you really ought to use a possessive pronoun with gerunds, not the direct object pronoun, which is better with to plus infinitive. Okay, we can also use it as the complement of the subject. His earliest memory is playing marbles. Now I want you to look here at the gerund, his earliest memory is playing marbles. If we look at a finite verb now, not a non-finite verb, but a finite verb, and treat playing as a finite verb, I hope you can see that there's a big difference between he is playing marbles and his earliest memory is playing marbles. They're very, very different, and it's hard to see these subtle nuances between different forms, but this is a main clause with a finite verb. This is a non-finite verb here. It's a gerund. It's the complement of the verb to be. And that means that we can swap it round. We can say playing marbles is his earliest memory. His earliest memory is playing marbles. We're complementing the subject. We're making an equivalence between the two. Try doing that now with this sentence, and you'll see very quickly that it can't be done. And so it's being used differently. You can't say playing marbles is he. It doesn't make any sense. You're not trying to say that there's an equivalence between he and the playing marbles. You're not using that, you're not using it in that sense. Here is the main verb. Here, playing is the main verb, and is the auxiliary verb. So here we've got a finite verb showing tense and number. Here we've got a non-finite verb, which is a gerund, which is a noun, which is the complement of the subject, his earliest memory. It's showing you an equivalence between his earliest memory and playing marbles. Now lastly, the participle, which is not a noun. It's an adjective, or perhaps more rarely, an adverb modifier. So participles can be used in a lot of different situations. They can be used as subordinate clause, first of all. And if it's used as a subordinate clause at the beginning, you're going to have a comma before the main clause, always. And the reason we call it an adjective is because playing the guitar is describing the subject of the main clause. Here we've got subject, verb, and then adverb, so we've got no object. We haven't got he sang a song, we've got he sang softly. So that's an adverb describing how he sang. So you could have a participle in a subordinate clause, and I warn you about this because I tell students always think in terms of subject, verb, object. However, when you're dealing with non-finite verbs, you mustn't think like that, because this playing the guitar is certainly not subject, verb, object. It's just adjectival phrase describing the subject of the main clause. So playing is a participle, the is a determiner, guitar is a noun. There's no subject, verb, object here. You've just got a participle phrase and then the main clause. And participle clauses are subordinate clauses. They don't make sense on their own. You can't just say playing the guitar, okay? And notice that playing the guitar hasn't got a subject until we start the main clause, and then it has got a subject. So they're very different from finite verbs. They're very different from main clauses. Now, participles can also function as reduced relative clauses. This is really important to see. You could say the man who was playing the guitar sang softly, or you could say the man playing the guitar sang softly. And the man who was playing the guitar is clearly, who was playing is a relative clause defining the man, so it's a defining relative clause. But you can get rid of the who was. You can drop them and make it a reduced relative clause, but it's still basically the same. It's still an adjective clause, which is a type of subordinate clause that modifies a noun. Yeah, it describes a noun. All relative clauses, maybe not all, but most relative clauses modify nouns, which makes them adjective clauses. Okay, so this is definitely an adjective clause. Playing the guitar describes the man. And remember, we can put these in different positions. We don't have to say the man playing the guitar sang softly. We could say the man sang softly, comma, playing the guitar, or playing the guitar, comma, the man sang softly. That comma has to be there because playing, the participle, has been separated from the man, which is the noun it's describing. And when that happens, you need a comma. Please see my video on participles and commas. I've done at least 2 of them. Put them in the search bar. If you want more information about that particular comma, that's in those videos on participles and commas. But I just wanted to show here that we could say playing the guitar, the man sang softly, or the man playing the guitar sang softly, or the man sang softly playing the guitar. They're all correct. They've all got participle clauses in there. And remember that the non-finite clause, it functions differently. It doesn't go subject, verb, object. It's important for parts of speech. Okay, so we could also use participles with subordinating conjunctions. For example, while, subordinating conjunction, trying to escape, comma, main clause, he broke his leg. Now, when they're used like this, they're adverbial rather than adjectival. If we think about it, the while trying to escape is modifying, it's telling you how he broke his leg or what was happening at the same time as he broke his leg. And for that reason, because it's modifying he broke his leg, it's an adverb rather than an adjective. So you can use participles as adverb modifiers as well as adjective modifiers. And of course, the easiest place, or the easiest, in some ways easiest, the easiest way you see a participle being used is just as a simple adjective. If you say the boring lesson, yeah, maybe this is a boring lesson. If you say the boring lesson, boring is a participle describing the lesson. The verb is to bore someone. And bored is the other participle. Don't forget that participles end in ed as well as ing. So bored is a participle, boring is a participle. Interested is a participle, interesting is a participle. And when you see them being used just to simply modify nouns, they just go before the noun. He was a broken man. Broken is a past participle. Yeah, so you can see it used like that, just as an adjective, as a simple adjective. They're not always in a participle subordinate clause like, I don't know, broken into 1,000 pieces, comma, the expensive vase was destroyed, or whatever, or the expensive vase was lying on the floor. Okay, I don't get time to read a lot of these questions that are coming up, but try to make them short and clear and precise, and I'll do my best. So I was doing this today just to try and show you that there are literally an infinite number of different clauses that you can have in a sentence. And if you get used to identifying finite, main clauses and non-finite parts of main clauses or subordinate clauses, it will make parts of speech much easier. And do remember that subordinate clauses might be without subjects. Sometimes they have a subject, a verb, and an object. For example, although I went to the park, comma, and then the main clause, which will also have a subject, verb, and object. But although I went to the park, I, subject, went, verb, to the park, object. So they might have a subject, verb, and object in a subordinate clause, but they might not do. When you say to get best results, you've got a 2 plus infinitive clause, which is a non-finite verb, and so it doesn't have a subject. So you have to analyse this one just in terms of straight away verb, to get, determiner, best, adjective, yeah, and then results, noun. So there's no subject, verb, object there in that first part, but the subject, verb, object comes here. You have to work hard. Yeah, there's your subject, verb, object. So remember, you can use the subordinate clause as a subject. You can also use subordinate clause as the object. And this is where relative clauses come back in. We call sentences like at the bottom, he understands what to do, he understands where to go, he understands who, or he knows whom I met. When you've got one of those WH words starting a clause, and clearly the clause is the object of the verb, that means you've got what's called a nominal relative clause. You could also call it a relative clause being used not as an adjectival clause, but as a noun phrase, as a noun clause. So that's functioning as a noun here, what to do. That's functioning as a noun, where to go. He knows whom I met. Whom I met is functioning as a noun. Okay, so it really depends on where it is in the sentence, what kind of function it's playing. And it's not just relative clauses which work as objects, which work as noun phrases, noun objects. I mean, certainly 2 plus infinitives can work as objects, as we've already seen. I want him to stay, I want to eat. So gerunds can function as objects. Participles can't, but gerunds and 2 plus infinitives can. Also, relative clauses can function as objects. And that clauses. He knows that I'm coming, I said that I'm coming, I told him that I'm coming. That I'm coming in all of those situations is the object of the verb. So that clauses, in which case that is a subordinating conjunction in these cases. That clauses are very common and they function as objects as well. And very often inside the subordinate that clause, you will have a subject and a verb, a finite verb showing tense and number. Okay, I hope that has been helpful. I hope it hasn't just made a whole mess of everything in your head. If it has, ask me a question right now. This is the time to ask questions, really, when I've already explained what's on the board. Yeah, if you've got something relating to this, now is the time to put it up, because now I've got my attention on the phone. Okay, if there are no questions, then thanks everybody for watching. I really appreciate you coming. Please click like on the video if you've enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all soon.